This video is going to provide some more details about what we're looking for in the fingerprints so that we could say, okay, this print is an exact match and belongs to a specific person. We'll also look at the different types of prints and how we can actually develop prints that we cannot see. So Rigiology here is the study of the uniqueness of these ridge patterns that we use for identification. All right, so the ridges on the fingerprints, those lines you kind of see, all right, if you notice, every print here is made of these, ridges and valleys, and there's also specific points where maybe the ridge does something different, like it jumps out or it splits. These are the minutia points, and those are the areas that we use to be able to identify a person's fingerprints. Okay, so you're looking for these differences in the prints because everybody's going to have maybe loops, arches, or whorls. So we got to look for something that's a little bit more specific here to a print that could be used to identify a specific print. Whenever we can get these minutia on two different prints to match, we call that a point of similarity here or points of identification. The idea is you want as many points of similarity or points of identification when you're comparing two prints to be able to say that they match. Okay, so the more of these unique differences that you can get to match, the more likely the prints are the same. So as of this very moment, there's no international standard for the number of points that you need to match up here. But some countries have specific results. So the United Kingdom, you'd need about 16 points to be in common between the two prints. Australia would require about 12. All right, so this is why it's very important that you're able to get a good, clear print because you want to be able to identify as many of these uh, differences, as many of these minutiae as possible between two prints. So you could say that, yes, they are the exact same. These are some of the different minutiae here that we can use to be able to compare two prints to be able to say they are the same. So we've already seen some of these in the first fingerprint video, but a core is kind of that central region. If you get this kind of circular region there, that's a core. If you have one of these ridges just come up and just stop, they call that an ending ridge, which would be different from a short ridge, which is a very much smaller kind of ridge that just kind of starts and then stops. Forks or bifurcations are a lot easier to see because you can clearly see a ridge coming and then just it splits off and it kind of looks like a fork. We've already looked at deltas, those triangular regions. Sometimes if you kind of have a ridge going and then kind of just branches off a little bit, they call that a hook. All right, that would be different from like a fork or bifurcation because the fork or bifurcation is going to go a little bit longer. All right, you can get these little dots or islands sometimes in a print. A crossover is pretty easy to see. It's basically when two ridges kind of cross over themselves and you get an X forming. All right, this is kind of a little different from a bridge. A bridge is when you have to kind of two ridges moving along and then you have this little line that just connects the two. All right, so these are just some of the different minutia that we could be looking for. And obviously, the more points that you can match here between two prints, the more likely they are that they are the exact same print. This is just a different look at some of these minutiae here. Most of these are the same, but I just want to point out a couple other ones. If you look, this would be a double bifurcation. It's kind of like when you have the split taking place and then the split happens again, or there's even a trifurcation where the ridge kind of splits into three. So those are some interesting ones. Again, you want to find as many of these minutiae to be the same between two prints because then those prints are more likely to be a match. So this print is labeled with some of these minutiae, and if you look close, you can clearly see what they're pointing at. An interesting one here that we did not mention yet is a scar. All right, you can usually see these pretty easily in prints, and they happen more often than you think. But a scar is basically just this white line that kind of moves across the print. So those are usually pretty easy to identify. All right, so you can look close at this and see some of these things here. You can see the bifurcations here that are kind of happening, the kind of splits that take place. There's even a double bifurcation right there. So definitely a good idea to maybe pause the video and kind of try to see these different minutia. Here's your chance to see if you can actually identify some of these minutia. So you could pause the video right now, take a moment and actually see if you can figure out what these lines are pointing at, and then just continue the video and you can see if you were right. Here are the answers for those minutia on this print. You can clearly see the scar here. This is pointing at the white line that kind of goes across. There's a nice crossover that takes place up here. All right. So you could check out some of the different things, including a pore, these kind of little openings there. Um, Keep in mind, some of these things are not always as easy to see if you don't get a good print. I mean, this print's pretty nice and blown up. So you might not be able to see all these things as perfect as if you don't have a nice blown up print. So here's another chance for you to look at a print and try to identify some of the minutia that might be here. All right, so you do got to look close, but it looks like I can see some form of bifurcation or fork right there. I can clearly see some pores, all right, in the picture. All right, the little white dots. There's also some islands here or dots. Okay, so you can look at this and see a bunch of different minutia, and that's what we want to be able to do. We want to be able to look at a print and try to identify some of these specific differences that might be there, because those are going to be important to be able to say that this print belongs to a specific person. So now that we finished looking at the different minutia, we want to look at the different types of prints that exist. So there are three types of prints. A plastic print would be a print that's left behind in a soft material. So let's just say there's, a form of putty or paint at a crime scene, and a fingerprint is left behind in that. That would be called a plastic print. A visible print is when, a person's fingers are covered in, a substance that when they touch another surface, they're leaving behind their print. So something like, if there was blood at a crime scene and then a person's touching an area, paint, ink, so on and so forth. All right, you literally see a visible print left behind. And then latent prints are prints that are left behind, but you don't see them. They're not visible to the naked eye. All right, these prints need to be developed. Whether you realize it or not, anytime you touch something, you're leaving a fingerprint behind. All right, your body has these oils and these secretions, and anytime you touch something, you are leaving behind a latent fingerprint. And there are different ways to develop these latent fingerprints so that we can see them. Many times, the prints that are left behind at a crime scene are latent prints, and you have to develop them. So there are a bunch of different ways to develop these latent prints. Some are maybe more familiar to you than others, but the biggest way is probably powders. All right, you use these powders that will stick to the deposits or the secretions in the latent fingerprint, and then they kind of make that print appear. All right, we try to use a color that would contrast the background. So, for example, if there was a fingerprint left behind on a dark surface, you would probably want to use maybe like a white powder or something that you would see. You would not want to use like a black powder on a black surface because you really would not see the print. All right, so that's when they use the little wand and they dust the powder on it and make the print visible. You can also develop latent prints using iodine. All right, if you put whatever material you're going to be printing into a container with some iodine, the iodine fumes will actually stick to the print. So they react with the oils and fats and they give you this kind of brownish color. You can see what that would look like over here. It actually works very well. All right, but it usually only works on porous surfaces. So things like paper, okay? Ninhydrin is another one. I've never done this one, but it actually reacts with the amino acids and it produces a purple color. So again, this works with porous substances like paper. Okay, so these are the first three ways of developing latent prints. There's two more ways to develop latent prints. All right, another way here is silver nitrate. You can actually spray this on something that you want to develop the print, and it reacts with the salt from perspiration, and it forms this kind of dark color. You're forming kind of silver chloride here, so you'll actually start to see the print develop that way. Again, I've never actually used that way. And then the last way here is something called superglue fuming. You can use superglue, which is also known as cyanoacrylate. All right, and basically, if you heat that up, okay, in a closed container with the substance that you want to print in there, all right, you will actually get the fumes kind of reacting with water and sticking to the print. And it forms this like whitish, hard print where the actual latent fingerprint was on the substance. So this actually works really good for non-porous surfaces. So, like harder things like cans and stuff like that. All right. So this is actually a pretty neat method. I mean, you might have seen it on some of those crime shows. But the key here is there's a lot of different ways to develop these latent prints, but we need to pick a test that we try not to destroy the evidence. All right, we would want to try to use those tests first, but sometimes here you might be stuck using one of the ways and it might destroy the evidence a little bit. So ideally we don't want to do that, but you might not have a choice. So these pictures here are just showing some of these different methods here for developing the latent print. So over here on the left, this would be an example of using iodine to develop some latent prints. As you can see, you get this kind of brownish print forming on the substance there. The iodine would be put in the container with it, and as iodine sublimates and turns to a gas, those fumes will stick to the print. Okay, and over here, this is a good example of using the superglue fuming. All right, when you put this Coke can in a container with some superglue, heat that superglue up, the fumes will stick to, okay, the latent prints, and you can see, all right, that the prints there were developed. It's very important though that the container is sealed, all right, in order for the fumes to interact with the latent print. Also, it's not something that you really want to be breathing in, so you really need to be making sure that that is totally sealed up when you're using that method. Aphis is the computer system here that can store prints and can be used to match prints. So if a print is found at a crime scene, it can be run through Aphis and it can be compared to the prints that are in the system and see if a match is found. All right. It's very important to understand that not everyone's prints are in Aphis. All right. You have to be convicted of certain types of crime, and then your prints will be in the system. All right. So if you haven't been convicted of a major crime, your prints are not going to be in this system. All right. So, you might find a fingerprint at a crime scene, but if the person who committed the crime is not in this system, it would not show up as a match. The last thing I want to talk about here are the other prints that could possibly be useful, in forensics. There are, prints on the bottom of your foot. There are palm prints, lip prints. All right, if you look here at the picture, you can see some of the different lip patterns that are possible. You could look at, eye blood vessels for security purposes. We even have now, facial scans and face ID and stuff like that. So there's other things that can be useful here. If a crime took place, it doesn't have to just be fingerprints. It's just that typically those are the types of prints that are more likely to be left behind, but other prints can be useful.